I'm Greg Donovan, coming to you live from Washington, D.C., where I've spent the better part of 2 decades tracking the gap between what politicians say on national television and what the data actually confirms when you run the numbers. And I want to be direct with you right from the start. What we witnessed in last night's State of the Union address was not merely spin. It was a structured, deliberate, and, in several critical areas, verifiably false political communication strategy designed to reshape public perception ahead of a deeply consequential legislative cycle. If you care about where this country is actually headed, not where the White House says it's headed, then this analysis is for you. Before I break this down, if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear an honest, data-grounded breakdown of what's happening in Washington. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and every analysis I put out is built on verified national data, structural political reasoning, and zero tolerance for narrative manipulation from either side of the aisle. Now let's get into it. President Trump stood before Congress last night and declared, and I'm quoting directly, "Members of Congress and my fellow Americans, our nation is back, bigger, better, richer, and stronger than ever before." I'll give him this much. He got half of that statement right. And that is precisely where the political mechanics of this communication become worth dissecting, because the half he got right tells you everything about whose interests this administration is actually engineered to serve. Since Trump returned to the presidency, his family's net worth has increased by approximately $4 billion. That is not a projection. That is a documented wealth accumulation, unprecedented in the modern era of American executive governance. We are also looking at a $400 million aircraft reportedly received as a gift from the Qatari royal family. A transaction that raises serious questions about the structural integrity of federal ethics frameworks and the extent to which personal financial interests are intersecting with foreign policy decision-making at the highest level of the executive branch. Now zoom out. Since the 2024 election, America's billionaire class has collectively seen a $1.5 trillion increase in wealth. I want you to sit with that number for a moment. $1.5 trillion in new wealth, concentrated at the very top of the income distribution, generated during a period when the administration is simultaneously claiming that the broader national economy is thriving. That is not a coincidence. That is the predictable output of a tax and regulatory architecture designed to maximize returns for high net worth individuals, while structural economic pressures on working and middle-class Americans continue to intensify. The result is measurable and stark. By every credible economic metric, income and wealth inequality in the United States is now at its highest recorded level in the nation's history. That is the data. That is what the numbers say. And the administration chose not to address it, not even tangentially, during a speech that ran for nearly 2 hours. Here is what Trump did not talk about last night, and this is where my analysis shifts to what I consider the most significant political communication failure, or more accurately, the most deliberate omission of the entire address. Today, over 60% of American households are living paycheck to paycheck. Not 20%, not 30%. 60% of the working population of the wealthiest nation on earth is one missed paycheck away from financial instability. These are people struggling to cover food, housing, healthcare, childcare, and basic education costs. That demographic reality does not align with the triumphant national narrative the administration is trying to sell, so it was simply left out of the speech. More than 20 million American households are currently spending more than half of their total income on housing. Nearly 800,000 Americans are homeless right now. These are not abstract statistics. They represent a structural failure in federal housing policy that no amount of rhetorical polish can paper over. And yet, not a single substantive housing policy proposal was put forward last night. 21% of American seniors are attempting to survive on less than $15,000 per year. I want that to register clearly. Nearly 1 in 4 older Americans is living below or just barely above the federal poverty line. Nearly half of all older workers have zero retirement savings. None. That is a retirement security crisis operating in real time, and it received no meaningful policy response from an administration that positioned itself as the champion of working Americans. Hundreds of thousands of qualified young people cannot afford a college education. More than 40 million Americans are currently burdened by student debt at levels that structurally suppress consumer spending, delay household formation, and dampen long-term economic productivity. And this country continues to record one of the highest rates of childhood poverty among developed nations on Earth. If that is the greatest economy in the history of humanity that the president referenced last night, then we have a serious problem with how we're defining economic success at the federal level. Let me now turn to the election integrity argument that Trump advanced last night, because this is where the political mechanics become genuinely alarming from a data integrity standpoint. The president stated, again, quoting directly, that he wants to stop illegal aliens and others who are unpermitted persons from voting in our sacred American elections, and that cheating is rampant. That is the framing. Now let me give you the structural reality behind that claim. I find the use of the word sacred here analytically interesting, and I'll tell you why. This is the same individual who, following the 2020 election, was documented pressuring Georgia's Secretary of State to find 11,180 votes, the exact margin needed to flip that state's outcome. That is a documented phone call. It is not contested. The sanctity of that particular election apparently did not register the same way. This is also the same individual who, and the evidentiary record on this is extensive, incited and provoked the violent insurrection of January 6, 2021, a direct effort to prevent the constitutional certification of an election result. More than 60 court cases, including cases heard by judges appointed by Trump himself, rejected every substantive legal challenge to the 2020 results. He continues to this day to assert that the 2020 election was stolen, and, critically, he is still not committed to respecting the two-term constitutional limit on the presidency. The Constitution is not ambiguous on this point. The 22nd Amendment limits individuals to 2 terms. The fact that this has not been clearly and publicly ruled out by the sitting president is a structural governance signal that I do not think the national media has adequately interrogated. Now let's put the actual election fraud data on the table, because this is where the gap between the administration's narrative and the verified record becomes most glaring. In the most recent national election, 154 million Americans across all 50 states cast ballots. Despite the scale of that participation, documented election fraud remains exceptionally rare. Here is the data point that I think every American needs to hear clearly. The Heritage Foundation, a conservative pro-Trump think tank, maintains a database of documented election crimes. In that database, covering the 21-year period from 2003 to 2023, during which hundreds of millions of votes were cast, the Heritage Foundation identified exactly 24 instances of non-citizens voting in United States elections. 24. In 21 years. That is not a crisis. That does not constitute rampant cheating. What it does constitute is a carefully manufactured political narrative, what I would classify as a high-functioning disinformation loop, designed to justify the legislative architecture that follows. And that architecture has a name, the SAVE Act. The SAVE Act would require every American to produce either a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. I want to walk through the structural implications of that requirement because the downstream demographic and electoral consequences are enormous. According to federal data, a significant share of American adults do not possess a valid passport. Passport ownership in the United States skews heavily toward higher income, college-educated, and urban demographics. Many Americans, particularly lower-income, rural, and elderly citizens, do not have readily accessible birth certificates either. Documents get lost. Records get destroyed. Government agencies charge fees to obtain copies. What the SAVE Act functionally produces, and I want to be precise here, is a tiered voter registration system in which access to the ballot is contingent on possession of documentation that is not uniformly or equitably distributed across the American population. Additionally, millions of American women who changed their last names following marriage hold documents with names that no longer match across identification records. This is not a minor administrative inconvenience. This is a structural disenfranchisement mechanism built on a documented non-problem and dressed up as election security policy. From a political economy standpoint, the math is straightforward. The demographic groups most likely to lack readily accessible passports and matching documentation, lower-income voters, minority voters, elderly voters, and young first-time voters, do not broadly align with the administration's electoral coalition. The policy design and the political incentive are structurally consistent. That is the analysis. I'll let you draw your own conclusions about intent. On the immigration front, Trump stated last night that he is deporting illegal alien criminals from our country at record numbers. That is the message. Here is the data. In Trump's first year back in office, less than 14% of individuals arrested by ICE had violent criminal records. That means 86% of those arrested, the overwhelming majority, did not have violent criminal histories. The record deportations of dangerous criminals framing does not survive contact with ICE's own operational data. What we are actually observing, and what Americans across the country are seeing in their cities and communities, is a broad-based enforcement operation that is not primarily targeting violent offenders. It is rounding up asylum seekers and, in documented cases, American citizens. ICE agents have been recorded conducting enforcement actions without due process protections. There are documented cases of children as young as 5 years old being held in detention facilities. There are verified cases of individuals being deported to countries they have never lived in direct violation of established legal protections. And then there is the footage, the recorded, documented video evidence of ICE and Border Patrol agents killing Renee Good and Alexander Petty. These are not allegations. These are recorded events. The administration's framing of its immigration enforcement operation as a precision-targeted criminal deportation effort is contradicted by the operational reality on the ground. That contradiction has significant political fallout implications as public awareness of these incidents continues to build across media platforms. Now let's move to healthcare, because this is where the gap between the administration's messaging and its actual legislative agenda is perhaps most direct and most consequential for the largest number of Americans. The president said last night that he is working to drive healthcare costs way down. I want to walk through what is actually happening in federal healthcare policy right now, because the legislative record tells a very different story. The administration's so-called Big Beautiful Bill includes approximately $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. That is not a projection. That is the documented legislative proposal. The projected impact of those cuts is the removal of approximately 15 million low-income and working-class Americans from their current health care coverage. The mechanism for that removal is straightforward. Reduce federal funding below the threshold required to sustain current enrollment, and coverage collapses for the most economically vulnerable segment of the insured population. The stated purpose of generating that $1 trillion in savings is to fund tax reductions for the wealthiest Americans. The resource reallocation is direct and documented. Healthcare coverage for 15 million working-class Americans is being stripped to finance tax breaks for the top 1% of earners. Those two facts, taken together, constitute the structural core of the administration's domestic economic agenda. And there is more. This year, health insurance premiums on the Affordable Care Act marketplace have doubled, on average, for approximately 20 million Americans. Premiums have doubled for 20 million people, while the president is telling a national television audience that he is driving healthcare costs down. The distance between that statement and that data point is not a matter of political interpretation. It is a measurable, documented contradiction. On prescription drug pricing, Trump stated last night that he is ending the wildly inflated cost of prescription drugs like has never happened before. Here is the reality. This year, the pharmaceutical industry announced price increases on more than 850 prescription drugs across the American market. Over 850 drugs are getting more expensive right now, in real time, under this administration. And despite any claims to the contrary, the United States continues to pay, by a significant margin, the highest prices for prescription drugs of any developed nation on earth. The structural drivers of that pricing disparity, the absence of federal negotiating authority at sufficient scale, the lobbying influence of the pharmaceutical industry, and the deliberate legislative protection of drug company profit margins remain fully intact. Here is my overall assessment as someone who has spent years analyzing the structural mechanics of federal governance and political communication strategy. What we witnessed last night was a carefully constructed narrative architecture designed to occupy the political communication space with confident, emotionally resonant claims that cannot survive rigorous data scrutiny. The strategy is not new, but it is being executed at a scale and intensity that I think demands a higher level of public analytical engagement than we are currently seeing in mainstream media coverage. The data pattern is consistent across every policy domain I've reviewed. Wealth concentration is accelerating while working-class economic insecurity deepens. Voter access is being structurally constrained under the cover of a documented non-problem. Immigration enforcement is being applied broadly rather than targeted at violent offenders, while due process protections are being bypassed. Healthcare coverage is being reduced for millions of low-income Americans to fund tax breaks for the wealthy. Prescription drug prices are rising while the administration claims credit for reductions that the data does not show. These are not partisan talking points. These are verifiable data points drawn from federal databases independent research institutions, and in several cases, the administration's own legislative proposals and agency records. The political feedback loop that sustains this communication strategy relies on the assumption that the gap between the official narrative and the data record will remain invisible to a sufficient portion of the public for long enough to accomplish the legislative and electoral objectives in play. What I am seeing across multiple states, and what the early data from special elections in places like Minnesota is beginning to confirm, is that the structural conditions are in place for a significant public accountability response. When voters have access to accurate information about what federal policy is actually doing to their economic security, their healthcare access, their retirement prospects, and their constitutional rights, the political calculus shifts. That is not a partisan statement. That is a structural observation about how democratic accountability mechanisms function when information quality improves. Let me also flag something that I think is being systematically underreported in the current media cycle, and that is the structural risk this communication pattern poses to long-term institutional credibility. When an administration consistently presents claims that diverge sharply from verifiable data on economic conditions, on election integrity, on immigration enforcement outcomes, on healthcare costs, it does not simply create a short-term credibility problem. It erodes the foundational public trust in federal institutions that democratic governance depends on to function. That erosion is not easily reversed. The longer it continues, the more significant the governance consequences become, independent of which party holds power. This is a structural concern, not a partisan one, and it deserves serious analytical attention from everyone covering national politics. There is also a media consumption dimension to this that I track closely. The audiences most exposed to the administration's unverified claims are, in many cases, the least likely to encounter rigorous fact-checking through their primary information channels. That is not an accident. It is a deliberate feature of the modern partisan media ecosystem, and it creates a durable information asymmetry that has real political consequences. Closing that gap, not through partisan counter-messaging, but through disciplined, data-grounded public analysis, is precisely why this kind of work matters. It is precisely why I do it, and it is precisely why I believe the audience for honest political analysis continues to grow. The American population is beginning to process the distance between what they were told and what they are experiencing. That gap between the official narrative and the lived economic reality of 60% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck is the single most important political variable in the current national environment. How that gap gets communicated, contextualized, and acted upon over the coming months will determine the trajectory of federal governance for years. That is not rhetorical. That is a structural assessment grounded in what I've observed across multiple political cycles. The moment the lived experience of a majority demographic cohort diverges sharply enough from the official narrative, the political environment becomes volatile in ways that are difficult for incumbents to manage, regardless of their media infrastructure or financial resources. We are approaching that threshold, and the data points I've outlined tonight are the clearest indicators of that trajectory that I currently have access to. I will continue monitoring this closely and bringing you the analysis as it develops. I'm Greg Donovan. I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. If this analysis added value to your understanding of what's happening at the federal level, please subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss an update. Like this video, share it across your networks, and let's keep building an audience that demands data-driven, structurally rigorous coverage of national politics. The work of holding power accountable starts with an informed public, and that is exactly what we are building here together. Let's move forward.